On November 20th, 1866, the doors opened to a building intended for a unique altruistic purpose. It was intended to be a great place with a great cause, and it started that way. Horrifyingly, that's not how it stayed at all. Over the years, it would become the exact opposite. The things that would go on to happen there and who they would happen to would be truly disturbing. This is the story of the Gettysburg Orphanage, and as always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. From the outside, and especially as a Canadian, the American Civil War feels like something most Americans grow up already knowing. It's one of those historical events that seems to almost exist in the background of American life. People know who the Union and the Confederates were, they recognize the names of major battles and generals, and they know which presidents were involved. And that makes complete sense. It was by far the deadliest war ever fought by Americans, and the changes it set in motion reshaped the country in ways that are still felt today. You'd probably rank it as one of the most important events in the nation's history. What might come as a surprise to some American viewers, though, is how little of that familiarity carries outside the United States. In my experience, non-Americans usually know the broad historical outcome and maybe recognize names like Gettysburg or Robert E. Lee, but often only as vaguely familiar references. So for the American viewers of the channel, the beginning of this story may sound familiar and even a rehash of common knowledge. And then for the non-American viewers who have little interest in the Civil War, this may feel like it's going a bit deeper than you'd normally care for, but it's just for a short little bit of context for the rest of the story. Anyways, in the late spring of 1963, the American Civil War reached one of its most consequential turning points. Just weeks earlier, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had won a stunning but costly victory over Union forces at Chancellorsville, Virginia. But although it was successful, the battle left Lee's army depleted and operating in a region already stripped of food and supplies by 2 years of the war. He would then go on to make a calculated gamble. Rather than wait for the Union army to recover and attack again, he chose to carry the war north. This would be only the second time a major Confederate army crossed into Union territory and the first on such a scale. This invasion also came with immediate practical benefits. Confederate troops could live off the rich farms of Maryland and Pennsylvania, easing pressure on Virginia's civilians and supply lines. But the political stakes were even higher. A Confederate victory on northern soil might weaken northern morale, influence the upcoming fall elections, and possibly pressure the Lincoln administration towards negotiations. Lee's ultimate goal then became to destroy the Union's main army in a single crushing battle. If that could be done in the North, the Union war effort could be thrown into chaos. And this all culminated in a battle in the town of Gettysburg. Interestingly, neither Lee nor the Union general intended to fight at Gettysburg. The town itself had no inherent strategic value, but it sat at the intersection of several major roads, making it a natural point of contact for armies. Early on the morning of July 1st, a Confederate division advanced towards Gettysburg, apparently looking for supplies, particularly shoes. But instead, they ran into Union cavalry. What followed was an accidental engagement that escalated rapidly. As the morning wore on, infantry from both armies arrived sporadically, each side committing more troops to what had begun as a skirmish. And then Lee, recognizing that a battle was unfolding, ordered his forces to converge on Gettysburg. This was the opportunity he had been waiting for. The Union line was thin, poorly anchored, and vulnerable to attack from multiple directions. By early afternoon, 2 Confederate groups struck hard from the north and northwest. Union defenses then collapsed and their troops were driven back through the streets of Gettysburg in a chaotic retreat toward a place known as Cemetery Hill, south of town. As the fighting intensified, Sergeant Amos Humiston of the 154th New York Infantry found himself in a desperate situation. His group was helping cover the withdrawal of Union troops falling back towards Cemetery Hill. He and other members of the 154th took cover behind a picket fence near a brickyard on the edge of town. Before long, though, they were hit by heavy fire from 2 advancing groups, and it was only a matter of time before their line broke away. When it did, Amos ran, trying to reach the safety of the hills south of Gettysburg, but he didn't make it far. He was shot and mortally wounded and collapsed not far from where he had been fighting. As the noise of battle faded around him, Amos reached for something that he had kept close since he received it. It was a small photograph of his 3 children that his wife had mailed to him only weeks earlier. Holding the photograph and likely thinking about the children he'd be leaving behind, Amos died on the first day of battle. 3 days later, after the fighting had moved on and the town began the task of recovery, a local woman came across Amos's body. Like thousands of others killed in the fighting, he had no identification on him. What distinguished his body from the others, though, was the photograph. The woman reached down and removed it from his grip before passing it along to her father, a man history only remembers as Mr. Shriver. Soon after receiving the photo, Mr. Shriver showed it to John Francis Bournes, a visiting doctor volunteering as a surgeon during the battle. John was particularly struck by the image and the story behind its discovery. Here was a dead, unidentified soldier who died holding a photograph of 3 children who were almost certainly waiting back home for a father who would never return. This was just heart-wrenching to John, and he soon made it his duty to determine who the soldier was so he could contact the family. With John's efforts, the story of the photograph began to circulate. Newspapers described it in detail, even though the image itself was never published, and the story of the unknown soldier and his children spread quickly, capturing public attention across the country. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away from Gettysburg, Felinda was waiting for word from her husband. Like many families with men on the front lines, she had grown used to long stretches of silence, but over the summer of 1863, weeks passed with no word from Amos. The last she heard from him was shortly before the fighting began in Pennsylvania, and by late summer, word began to settle in. Then, when newspapers began publishing detailed descriptions of the photograph found on the dead soldier's body, Felinda recognized it immediately. The papers were describing the image she had mailed to Amos just a month before his death, and by October, the truth finally reached her that Amos was dead. For John, the photograph began to represent more than just the loss of Amos, and it became a small piece of the larger picture of what war was doing to families. Even after Amos was identified by Felinda, John remained personally interested in the family and saw an opportunity to take action. He began distributing reproductions of the image for a small fee, and the proceeds, John said, were intended to support Amos's children, and more broadly, other children who had lost fathers in Union service. At the time, Gettysburg itself was struggling with the aftermath of the battle and the wider war. Families had been shattered and providers had been killed in service, while poverty and illness claimed many of the women they left behind. Children without parents or stable homes became an increasingly visible problem, and in Gettysburg, the town lacked the resources to handle the need. Out of all of this, a larger idea began to take shape in John's mind, and this is how a permanent home where children of the fallen Union soldiers could be housed and educated was established. The photograph that Amos died holding became the foundation for that effort, and soon plans were underway to set up an orphanage on the Gettysburg battlefield. The building that would house the orphanage was constructed in 1836, years before Gettysburg became synonymous with the Civil War. In the summer of 1863, so 30 years later, it stood along Baltimore Street at the northern base of Cemetery Hill, directly in the path of fighting. During the battle, the building served as a Union field hospital where wounded men were carried inside and laid out room by room. As you might imagine, the work inside was rough. Surgeons worked wherever space allowed, performing amputations under brutal conditions. Removed limbs were carried out and piled nearby until they were stacked as high as the windows. The dead and dying filled the building, and even the surrounding ground became a temporary burial site for soldiers killed in action. The scale of the destruction overwhelmed the town, and the smell of it lingered for weeks. Residents apparently even soaked handkerchiefs in lavender or peppermint oil and held them to their faces just to move through the streets. It's estimated that more than 7,000 men died during the 3-day battle, but when the war finally ended, the national numbers were staggering. An estimated 620,000 men were killed, good enough to account for about 2% of the country's population at the time. This was the backdrop for the creation of the National Homestead of Gettysburg, which is more commonly referred to as the Gettysburg Orphanage. It was one of the first of its kind established after the war, and for the community of Gettysburg, its location in the middle of the battlefield felt appropriate. A place that had seen so much suffering during the battle would now be used to care for its youngest victims. At least, that is how it was seen at first. The Gettysburg Orphanage officially opened its doors on November 20th, 1866, and among the first to arrive there were Felinda and her 3 children. She had been asked by John to be the home's first head matron, and she agreed to move to Gettysburg to take the role. In its earliest days, the homestead housed roughly 30 to 35 children, but the numbers quickly climbed. As more orphans arrived, the building grew crowded, which prompted the construction of an addition to accommodate as many as 80 to 100 children at a time. Despite the limited space, though, the atmosphere inside the orphanage was largely positive. Children were fed regularly, clothed properly, educated, and given plenty of free time. They also played outdoors and attended community events where they were a visible and heartwarming part of life in the town. It would go on to be so successful that it drew attention and visits from prominent figures, including Union General and future President Ulysses S. Grant. For many, the home was just evidence that the country was trying to care for children left behind by the war, but unfortunately, the stability the orphanage enjoyed wouldn't last. 3 years later, in 1869, Philinda remarried and moved away to Massachusetts, leaving behind a massive void at the orphanage. The board then turned to John for guidance on what to do next. He then recommended a woman named Rosa J. Carmichael and presented her as someone uniquely qualified for the position. Rosa claimed to have extensive experience with children and described herself as a strict disciplinarian. This, along with John's endorsement, carried a lot of weight, and in 1870, Rosa was approved by the board as the new head matron. Immediately upon her arrival, though, the atmosphere inside the orphanage changed. Under Philinda, the children's experience had been marked by routine, structure, security, and stability, but Rosa's approach centered on rigid discipline and harsh punishment. She had never been married and had no children of her own, and by many accounts, she seemed to have little patience for the ones under her care. At first, these changes may not have been obvious to outsiders. The orphanage continued operating as it always had, and there was little oversight from authorities. It was a private institution, and as long as the children were housed and fed, few questions were asked. Inside the building, however, the tone had shifted. The children became quieter and were seen playing outside far less often than before. And it seemed that the sense of safety and balance that had once defined the home had been replaced by fear. As Rosa settled into her role, meals grew smaller and less frequent. Clothing also went unrepaired and unreplaced, and accounts of former orphans and information learned in later investigations painted a consistent picture of neglect and mistreatment. She apparently relied on humiliation and physical suffering to enforce obedience. Orphans would be attacked or left isolated for long periods of time, cut off from contact with anyone else in the building. In the basement of the orphanage, older orphans were often shackled to the walls by chains, while younger ones were subjected to punishments designed around their size. Since the shackles were too large for the tiny wrists of the youngest, Rosa designed a disturbing punishment for them. She would place them inside barrels filled with cold water and tie their wrists to the sides to keep them from slipping under. For those barely taller than the barrels themselves, the strain was extremely painful and exhausting. Then another of Rosa's punishments involved forcing them to stand for hours at a time. They were often placed on chairs or tables and ordered not to move. When exhaustion inevitably set in and they collapsed, they were punished again for disobedience. Then some of the harshest punishments took place in a small, windowless space in the basement known among the children as the pit. It measured only a few feet across and sat at the end of a pitch-dark passageway, and the orphans sent there were tied or shackled to the walls and left in total darkness for days at a time. Some accounts even describe rats biting at their feet while they were restrained. This discipline extended beyond the building itself, too. In the yard behind the orphanage, they were sometimes tied to a split-rail fence and left exposed to the heat of the summer. Former orphans also later recalled being left there for long stretches while stray dogs wandered nearby and snapped at them as they stood helpless. As you might imagine, the overall effect of these practices on orphans of Gettysburg was devastating. Orphans who arrived already traumatized by war and loss were subjected to a type of cruelty that broke them down even further. This went on for years unchecked, and the pattern of mistreatment might have continued indefinitely if not for a series of events that finally forced attention on what Rosa was doing. One of the children at the orphanage during its operation was a boy named Robert Turner. At some point during his confinement there, Robert died mysteriously. In response, Rosa reported nothing beyond vague claims of illness. No doctor was called and no record of Robert's death was made. Instead, she simply secretly buried him in the backyard of the orphanage. It wasn't until much later that officials learned of this and got involved. When Robert's body was exhumed and examined, however, his cause of death wasn't found to be illness, it was starvation that killed him. And the revelation of this confirmed what rumors around the town were starting to hint at. Around the same time, other incidents added to the growing concern. On Christmas Eve in 1876, cemetery caretakers walking home from a church service passed the orphanage and heard an orphan crying for help from behind the building. They quickly went to investigate where the noise was coming from, and they found a boy named Georgie London locked inside an outhouse on a freezing night. Rosa had apparently placed him there as punishment and left him to endure the cold alone. Simultaneously, inside the orphanage, the children were becoming increasingly desperate. One of the older boys, Richard Hutchison, was known to act as an enforcer for Rosa. The other children actually used to call him Stick Boy because he used to walk around with a stick and use it on the others at Rosa's urging. Despite this role though, Richard ultimately became one of the key figures in exposing what was happening at the orphanage. One night he snuck out and walked roughly 20 miles to a neighboring town called Waynesboro. There he alerted authorities to the treatment of the children at the Gettysburg Orphanage. This act alone also makes you wonder if his obedience was simply a way to keep attention off of himself. But in any case, public concern grew even more in the spring of 1876 when the orphanage children failed to appear in Gettysburg's annual Memorial Day parade. For years to that point, they had marched to the National Cemetery to place flowers on the graves of fallen soldiers, and their absence in 1876 was immediately noticed. Locals began asking more questions, and eventually the Gettysburg chapter of the Grand Army of the Republic stepped in and began to look into the claims. As a result of that investigation, Rosa was arrested and charged with multiple counts of cruelty to children. In court, she was found guilty on only one of the charges, the one related to Georgie being locked in the outhouse on Christmas Eve. The penalty for this crime was a $25 fine plus court costs, and she was ordered to leave Gettysburg. This was actually the harshest punishment legally available under the circumstances for a woman at the time, but to many, it was nowhere near enough. Rosa denied all accusations against her and claimed the charges were fabricated to destroy her reputation. She apparently even refused to leave the town and return to the orphanage to continue overseeing the children for several more terrifying months. But then something interesting happened. Just as quickly as she arrived at town, Rosa simply vanished one night and no one knows what became of her. Her disappearance fueled speculation in town as word spread of her departure. At the time, birth records were inconsistent and identification was easy to alter, making it possible for someone to change their name and start over elsewhere without much difficulty. She could have simply left and found work in another town under a new identity. Some suspected that she may have reconnected with John, who helped her find work elsewhere. Then there was also the dark rumor that local citizens who were outraged by what had happened to the children took matters into their own hands. The story goes that she was murdered by a mob and buried somewhere in a field outside the town. None of these theories, however, have ever been proven, and Rosa's ultimate fate remains lost to history. What is documented, however, is how the story finally broke beyond the town limits of Gettysburg. In June of 1877, details of the treatment at the orphanage were published in a Philadelphia newspaper, bringing wider attention to what had occurred in the homestead. With public scrutiny growing and confidence in the home shattered, the end came quickly as the orphanage closed its doors for good in December of that year. With Rosa gone and the children moved to other institutions, the worst of it was over, but the story of the orphanage wasn't. As attention faded from the horrible things that happened there, the spotlight began to shift onto John, the man whose fundraising efforts and public image had helped bring the orphanage into existence. While John presented himself as a man moved by the story of Amos and his children, later revelations showed that much of the money raised for the orphans never reached them. John was apparently skimming off the top of donations, and funds intended for food, clothing, and education were diverted into his own pockets. Apparently, even the original image Amos died holding was never returned to his family and was likely sold for John's own profit. He was never meaningfully held accountable for these actions either. His financial misconduct didn't carry the same weight as Rosa's physical mistreatment, and it more easily slipped into the background. The epilogue to the story of the Gettysburg Orphanage leans heavily on a topic that isn't usually covered much on the channel, but we'll go over the claims anyway and leave it up to you to make up your own mind. Long after the children were removed and the orphanage closed, stories involving strange events began to circulate about the building. Many of the reported encounters that have occurred in the orphanage center on the basement, particularly the areas that were once used for punishment. Visitors have described sudden drops in temperature, an oppressive heaviness in the air, and an overwhelming sense of sadness that comes on without warning. Some even report hearing the faint voices of children whispering or crying softly despite the rooms being empty. Other accounts describe physical sensations. People have felt their clothing tugged on, especially around their legs or skirts, as if small hands were pulling for attention. Unexplained handprints have also supposedly appeared on dusty surfaces and windows, which are always too small to belong to an adult. One of the most frequently mentioned apparitions is that of a young girl in a worn, outdated dress. Those who have seen her say that she remained silently staring at them before disappearing into thin air. Sightings place her both upstairs and in the cellar, and some visitors believe she represents one of the children who suffered under Rosa's care, although no specific identity has ever been confirmed. There are also reports of Rosa herself showing up at the orphanage, typically described as tall and stern-looking. Other reported phenomena are smaller, yet still enough to make visitors' skin crawl. Lights flicker despite modern wiring, doors apparently open and slam shut without explanation. A phantom cat is occasionally mentioned by staff and visitors alike, and some claim to encounter a playful apparition who introduced himself as Adam and wishes people a happy birthday. Nearly all who have spent time in the building describe leaving the basement emotionally shaken, sometimes in tears, without ever being able to explain why. At least, this is all what's been reported. Today, the former orphanage still stands as part of Gettysburg's historic landscape. Preserved and maintained, it's included in walking tours that focus on both Civil War history and the darker chapters that followed it. The building, as you might imagine, is also a hot destination for paranormal tours where guides recount both the documented history and the experiences reported by visitors over the years. Disturbing discoveries also continue to be made inside the old orphanage to this day. In 2025, restoration work on the property uncovered what is alleged to be the left rib bone of a child. This reopened old questions and underscored how much of the building's history remains unresolved. Even with extensive documentation, parts of the orphanage's story are still incomplete. Records are missing and some children were never fully accounted for, meaning the true extent of what happened inside those walls may never be known. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching, and a special thanks to everyone who supports the channel on Patreon or as a channel member. If you're interested, we offer early access videos that are released roughly a week before the regular YouTube uploads. Also, if you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it using the form found in the description. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.